I remember the taste of rust. It is the first thing I remember, before faces, before names, before I understood what memory even was. I was 6 years old, crouched in darkness so complete that my eyes had stopped trying to see, and I was licking condensation from a pipe that ran along the ceiling of our HAB unit on sub-level 47. The water was warm, almost hot from whatever it carried through the endless network of conduits that kept the hive alive. It tasted of metal and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my tongue tingle and my throat burn slightly as I swallowed. I thought it was sweet. This is what it means to be born in the underhive. Your first memories are not of sunlight or a mother's face, or the comfort of clean sheets. Your first memories are of thirst, and the particular way that toxic runoff becomes the closest thing to pleasure you will ever know. I would wait for hours beneath that pipe, watching the droplets form in the blackness, catching them on my tongue like some faithful supplicant waiting for a blessing that would never come. And in those moments, I was happy. I did not know that water could taste any other way. I did not know that there were children, somewhere far above me in the upper levels, who drank from fountains and complained when their beverages were not cold enough. The darkness was total. Not the darkness of a room with the lights turned off, but the absolute absence of illumination that exists in places where light has not reached in centuries. The kind of darkness that makes you forget you have eyes, that turns sight into a useless organ, a vestigial reminder of a world that exists only in inherited memory. We learned to navigate by sound and touch, and the subtle shifts in air pressure that told us when a corridor opened into a larger space, or when the walls pressed close enough to brush against our shoulders. But there was light, of a kind. I learned to see it after my eyes gave up trying to pierce the black. Bioluminescent fungi that grew on the bodies of those who died, and were not immediately processed by the reclamation teams. They would lie where they fell, in the forgotten corners and abandoned passages that riddled sub-level 47, like wormholes in rotted wood, and within days, the fungi would begin to spread across their flesh. A faint blue-green glow, soft and gentle, that turned corpses into lanterns. I remember finding an old man, his name unknown to me then and forever, who had collapsed against a support pillar and died there. By the time I discovered him, perhaps a week after his passing, he was covered in luminescent growth. His face glowed with a peaceful light, his outstretched hands shimmering in the darkness, like the hands of a saint in one of the faded holy images sometimes scratched into the walls. I thought he was beautiful. I would sit beside him when I needed to see, when the darkness pressed too heavily, and I needed the reassurance that the world still had shape and form. I did my learning there, practicing the few letters that another child had taught me, scratching them into the rust and grime on the floor, while the dead man's glow provided just enough light to see by. When the fungi finally consumed him entirely and his body collapsed into a pile of luminescent decay, I felt the loss like a personal grief. My lamp had gone out. I was alone in the darkness again. This is how you measure childhood in the underhive, not in birthdays or school years, or the proud moments when you learn to read or write or think. You measure it in the space between one source of light and the next, in the time between finding one corpse and discovering another that can serve the same purpose. You measure it in the taste of rust on your tongue and the particular way your body learns to process poison and call it sustenance. I learned later that the pipe I licked condensation from was part of a cooling system that served the manufactorums on level 32, and that the water running through it carried industrial solvents and heavy metals in concentrations that should have killed me. But children in the underhive develop tolerances that would astound the Medicae facilities in the upper spires. We adapt or we die, and adaptation happens too quickly for anyone to call it miraculous. It is simply selection, brutal and efficient, separating those who can survive from those who cannot. The Hive stretched above and below us in dimensions that the human mind was not designed to comprehend. Tens of thousands of levels stacked upon each other, reaching kilometers into the poisoned sky, and descending even deeper into foundations laid during the dark age of technology. Sub-level 47 was not even close to the bottom. There were levels below us where the darkness was so old it had weight, where the air itself had turned solid with accumulated toxins, where things lived that had forgotten they were ever human. And above us, rising toward a sky we would never see, were levels of increasing habitability, each one slightly less hellish than the one below, until somewhere far overhead the nobility lived in spires of crystal and gold, breathing air that had never touched recycled filters. We existed in the middle of that descent, in the place where humanity clung to existence by its fingernails. Our HAB unit was 3 meters by 4, housing 7 people when everyone was present, which was rare. My mother worked 18-hour shifts in a textile reclamation facility, sorting through mountains of industrial waste for fabric that could be reprocessed and sold to the lower-level manufacturers. I rarely saw her. When she was home, she was asleep, her body curved into whatever space was available on the floor, too exhausted even to dream. Her hands were stained permanently black from the chemicals they used to break down the waste materials, and her cough was wet and constant, a sound that became part of the ambient noise of our lives. My father was a shadow, a figure I remember in fragments that might be memory or might be imagination. Dark hair, I think, a scar across his jaw. He disappeared when I was 7, and no one ever explained where he went. In the Underhive, disappearance requires no explanation. People vanish for 1,000 reasons, most of them fatal, and searching for answers is a luxury that costs time and calories no one can spare. I stopped thinking of him within months. Grief is expensive, and we were poor in ways that made monetary poverty seem quaint. The others in our HAB unit were siblings in the loosest sense of the word. We might have shared a mother or a father or neither. Genetics were irrelevant. What mattered was proximity and the shared understanding that we were all responsible for each other's survival until we were old enough to be responsible only for our own. There was Kyle, older than me by perhaps 3 years, who taught me which fungi were safe to eat and which would make you vomit until your stomach turned inside out. There was Mira, younger, who cried often until the crying simply stopped, and she became silent in the way that broken things are silent. There were others whose names I have forgotten, whose faces have blurred into the general mass of Underhive children, indistinguishable from each other in their hunger and their haunted eyes. The smell of our HAB unit was the smell of unwashed bodies pressed too close together, of recycled air that had passed through too many lungs, of the protein paste we ate once per day when the dispensary machines were functioning. The paste came in the same shade of gray regardless of its supposed nutritional content, and it tasted like nothing at all, like the absence of flavor, like eating the concept of food rather than food itself. The sound was grinding machinery that never stopped, a low, constant vibration that came up through the metal floor and into our bones. After a while, you stopped hearing it consciously, but it was always there, a reminder that the Hive was alive in its own mechanical way, digesting its human population, processing us into something useful. Childhood here was not measured in years, but in survival milestones. Your first survival milestone was learning to drink poison without dying. Your second was learning to navigate the darkness without falling into the countless pits and chasms that opened unexpectedly in the floors of abandoned sections. Your third was learning when to fight and when to run, and when to simply disappear into the shadows and wait for danger to pass. But the milestone that changed everything came at age 8, when my designation number appeared on a list posted outside the administratum office on sub-level 45. informing me that I had been selected for aptitude testing. Work placement examinations were rare, administered perhaps once every 5 years, and most children in the Underhive would live and die without ever seeing their number called. The selection criteria were mysterious, based on algorithms and data assessments that had nothing to do with merit or potential, and everything to do with quotas that needed to be filled in some distant bureaucratic calculation. I did not question why I had been chosen. You learned early not to question anything that might represent a change in circumstance, however unlikely that change was to improve your situation. The testing facility was located on level 32, which meant traveling upward through 15 levels, the furthest I had ever been from sub-level 47. The journey itself was transformative in ways I could not have anticipated. We climbed through access corridors and maintenance shafts, past checkpoints where board officials glanced at our designation papers and waved us through without interest. And with each level we ascended, the world changed. The air became cleaner, or rather, less aggressively toxic. The caustic bite that had always existed at the back of my throat began to fade, replaced by something that approached breathable atmosphere. The darkness lifted gradually, dim emergency lighting giving way to actual illumination, flickering fluorescent tubes that hurt my eyes with their unexpected brightness. The walls were less corroded, the floors less treacherous with gaps and broken grating. There was less water dripping from the ceilings, less fungal growth spreading across every surface, less of the organic decay that characterized the lower levels. By the time we reached level 32, I was breathing air that did not make my lungs burn, walking through corridors where I could see more than 3 meters ahead, surrounded by people whose clothing was not uniformly stained with chemical residue and industrial grime. Children passed us in the hallways, children approximately my age, and they were clean. Their clothes fit properly, showing no signs of being salvaged from reclamation heaps and re-sewn multiple times. Their skin was unmarked by the burns and rashes that covered every child I had ever known. And they were reading, carrying data slates and actual paper books, discussing concepts and ideas I had no framework for understanding. I stared at them with the fascination of someone observing an alien species. The testing chamber was bright and sterile, filled with rows of simple desks and chairs. They seated us, perhaps 30 children from various lower levels, and distributed examination papers covered with symbols and questions that might as well have been written in a Xenos language. I recognized perhaps one word in 10. The questions referenced concepts I had never encountered, assumed knowledge of basic mathematics and literacy that no one had ever thought to teach us. I filled in random marks, mimicking the patterns I saw others making on their papers, understanding nothing. I failed, of course. We all failed. All of us from below level 40. The test was not designed to identify potential among the Underhive population. It was designed to confirm that we belonged exactly where we were, to provide statistical justification for keeping us there. But the journey had planted something dangerous inside me. The knowledge that there were other ways to live, that the universe extended far beyond the darkness of sub-level 47, that children existed who had never tasted rust or learned to navigate by the glow of fungus growing on corpses. I returned home carrying the terrible burden of hope, and hope in the Underhive is a poison more toxic than anything that ran through the pipes I drank from. Hope lasted 2 years. At age 10, I was assigned to the textile reclamation facility where my mother worked, sorting through mountains of industrial waste for materials that could be salvaged and reprocessed. The dangerous burden I had carried home from level 32 was ground down within the first week, crushed as efficiently as the Fey material that passed through the massive sorting machines that dominated the facility floor. The work was simple in concept and devastating in execution. We stood at long conveyor belts that moved endlessly through the facility, carrying heaps of discarded industrial fabric, metal fragments, plastic components, and substances I could not identify. Our job was to separate the salvageable from the unsalvageable, to pull from the moving waste stream anything that still held value, and to do it quickly enough that the overseers did not notice us slowing production. The conveyor belts never stopped. They ran 24 hours a day, fed by inputs from hundreds of levels above us, carrying the detritus of the upper hive down to be processed by the cheapest labor available. The rusted metal cut through juvenile flesh with ease. My hands were covered in slashes within the first day, some shallow, some deep enough that I could see the white of bone beneath the blood. Chemical burns came from unidentified substances that looked harmless until your skin began to blister and peel away. The older workers, those who had survived long enough to develop cruel efficiency, showed us which materials to avoid touching directly and which could be handled if you were quick enough. But even with their guidance, injuries were constant. There was no medical treatment beyond crude bandages torn from the very fabric we were sorting. Infections were common. Amputations happened in the shadows, performed by workers with rusted blades and no concept of sterilization. The hierarchy among the damned was rigid and absolute. Overseers walked the facility floor with shock mauls, striking anyone who slowed or faltered or showed signs of exhaustion. They were under Hive themselves, elevated by some accident of selection to positions of minor authority, and they wielded their power with the enthusiasm of those who had spent years being beaten and now had the opportunity to do the beating. Below them were the older workers, veterans of decades in the facility, who had learned that survival meant maintaining pace regardless of cost. And below them were us, the children, competing for the least dangerous positions at the sorting belts, fighting each other for spaces where the waste stream moved slightly slower, or the lighting was slightly better. I learned the first real lesson of underhive survival during my 3rd month at the facility. Empathy is a luxury that costs calories you cannot spare. A girl named Sarah worked beside me at the sorting belt, perhaps 9 years old, with hands already scarred from months of labor. She was slow, tired, distracted by pain or hunger or simple exhaustion. I saw her lean too far over the belt, reaching for a piece of copper wire that had value, saw her balance shift, saw the moment when she realized she was falling. She reached out toward me, her eyes wide with terror, her hand grasping for mine. I pulled back. She fell into the grinding mechanisms that processed the unsalvageable waste. The sound was brief, mechanical, efficient. Metal teeth designed to shred industrial fabric made quick work of flesh and bone. Her scream lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the machinery reduced her to component elements indistinguishable from the rest of the waste stream. Blood sprayed across my face and chest, warm and copper-tasting, and then it was over. No one stopped the machines. The overseers did not even look up from their positions. The older workers continued sorting, their hands moving with practiced precision. The conveyor belt carried Sarah's remains away to be processed with everything else. Time was money, and money flowed upward through the levels of the hive while waste, including human waste, flowed down. I wiped her blood from my face and returned to work. Within an hour, another child had taken her position at the belt. Her name was forgotten by the end of the shift. That lesson served me well for 2 years. I survived the reclamation facility by understanding that every hand extended toward another person was a hand that could not protect yourself. That every moment spent helping someone else was a moment when your own sorting pace slowed and brought the overseer's shock mauls down upon your shoulders. I became efficient, mechanical, my hands moving across the conveyor belt with the same thoughtless precision as the grinding wheels that had consumed Sarah. I stopped learning names. I stopped seeing faces. There were only bodies, obstacles, competition for the safer positions along the sorting line. At age 12, my younger sister disappeared. Mira had been silent for years by then, the girl who had cried until crying became impossible. She worked in a different section of the facility, sorting plastic components from chemical waste, and I rarely saw her during shifts. When she did not return to the HAB unit after 3 consecutive days, I knew she had been taken. Children disappeared constantly into the Hive, but there were patterns to the disappearances, signatures that indicated which of the gangs had claimed them. The way she vanished, quietly, during a shift change, with no witnesses and no body left behind, marked it as the work of the Scars, one of the larger gangs that controlled the territories beyond official Imperial authority. I went looking for her because she was the last connection I had to anything resembling family. My mother had died the previous year, her lungs finally giving out after decades of breathing chemical-saturated air. The others from our HAB unit had scattered or been consumed by the Hive's grinding necessities. Mira was all that remained, and even knowing that empathy was a luxury I could not afford, I found myself unable to simply let her vanish without acknowledgement. The search took me into territories where even the Arbites did not venture. Vast fungal forests growing in ancient transit tunnels, fed by chemical runoff and the accumulated decay of 10,000 years. The fungi here grew larger than any I had seen before. Mushroom caps the size of HAB units, stalks thick as support pillars, creating canopies that blocked what little light filtered down from the levels above. Settlements had been built inside the hollowed-out carcasses of machinery so ancient that its original purpose had been forgotten. Great metal shells that might once have been vehicles or generators or weapons, now serving as shelter for those who existed completely outside Imperial record. The gang ruled here with the same absolute authority the overseers wielded in the reclamation facility, but they dressed their brutality in the language of faith. I found their leader in what had once been some kind of control chamber, seated on a throne made from welded scrap metal and human bones. His face bore a tattoo of the Imperial Aquila, crude and oversized, the two-headed eagle stretching from his forehead to his chin. He spoke of the Emperor's protection while his followers trafficked in narcotics extracted from the fungal forests and flesh purchased or stolen from the levels above. "Your sister serves a purpose now," he told me, his voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone who had learned to weaponize kindness. "She brings value to our community. The Emperor protects those who are useful." I understood then what I had begun to suspect during my journey to level 32, 2 years earlier. The Imperium's reach extended everywhere, but its care extended nowhere. The Emperor's name was invoked by nobles and gang leaders alike, by those who lived in crystal spires and those who ruled fungal forests, and the invocation meant nothing. It was simply another tool, another mechanism of control, as meaningless and as necessary as the shock mauls the overseers carried. Mira was not found. I was given a choice: join the Scars, or be sold to the same establishments where my sister now worked, servicing the appetites of those who had enough currency to pay for such things. I joined. My first kill came at age 13 during a territorial dispute over a water reclamation station. Another child, perhaps 14, from a rival gang. I used a piece of sharpened rebar, drove it through his throat, watched him drown in his own blood on the metal floor. The taste of copper became as familiar as the taste of rust. I killed 6 more times over the next 3 years. Each one became easier, not because I developed a taste for violence, but because I developed an absence of feeling toward it. The copper taste became background, as unremarkable as the rust I had drunk as a child. The gang consumed me the way the reclamation facility had consumed my mother, the way the Hive consumed everyone, turning us into components of its endless machinery. By age 15, I could navigate the fungal forests blindfolded, knew which rival gang members could be negotiated with and which had to be killed on sight, understood the economics of narcotics and flesh and violence with the clarity of someone who had never been taught any other form of mathematics. When the imperial tithe came to the Hive, I volunteered immediately. The recruitment drive was massive. Administratum officials and Astra Militarum officers establishing processing stations throughout the lower levels, seeking to fill quotas for regiments being deployed to conflicts I had never heard of on worlds whose names meant nothing to me. The propaganda pics showed soldiers in clean uniforms standing victorious over alien corpses, promised glory and honor and service to the Emperor, spoke of citizenship and purpose and belonging to something greater than yourself. I knew it was all performance, all carefully constructed narrative designed to make conscription sound like opportunity. But I volunteered anyway, because even a lie about escape was preferable to the truth of remaining. The medical processing was brutal in its thoroughness. They examined every centimeter of our bodies, cataloguing the damage that Underhive existence had inflicted upon us. Chemical burns scarred across my hands and forearms, lung capacity reduced by years of breathing toxins, bone density compromised by malnutrition, vision degraded by decades spent in near-total darkness, liver and kidney function showing the strain of processing substances that should have killed me. I watched hundreds of potential recruits rejected as unfit, their bodies too damaged even for the Astra Militarum's minimal standards. The rejected ones shuffled back toward the territories they had come from, carrying the knowledge that they were not even useful enough to die in the Emperor's service. I passed barely, designated suitable for light infantry, not strong enough for shock troops, not healthy enough for specialized roles, but adequate for being issued a laser gun and pointed toward an enemy. They marked my designation papers with stamps and codes I did not understand, filed me into processing groups with thousands of others who had similarly passed the minimum threshold for expendability. The weeks of waiting for off-world transport were spent in holding facilities on level 28, higher than I had ever been, except for that single journey to take the aptitude test 7 years earlier. We were fed regularly, provided with clean water and basic medical treatment, given uniforms that fit properly, and boots that had never been worn by someone else. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it felt like being fattened for slaughter. During those weeks, I was exposed to higher-level imperial bureaucracy for the first time. Officers who processed our paperwork with mechanical efficiency, discussing recruitment quotas and transport schedules with the same detached professionalism that overseers had used when discussing production rates at the reclamation facility. I heard them talk about the Hive as a resource to be harvested, about underhive populations as renewable supplies of military personnel, about how the toxic conditions and brutal selection pressures created soldiers who were already adapted to the worst conditions the galaxy could offer. The truth settled over me like the darkness of sub-level 47. The Hive produced millions of citizens, and the Imperium viewed us all as interchangeable resources. I was not special for surviving. Every moment of suffering, every compromise made, every person I had killed or failed to save, none of it had been exceptional. The survival itself was simply another form of selection, a culling that determined who was strong enough to be worth exporting to die on distant battlefields. The gang leader's words echoed back across 3 years. The Emperor protects those who are useful. The rest of us, he simply uses. I had been useful enough to survive the Underhive. Now I would be useful enough to die for the Imperium. The distinction seemed meaningless. That realization should have brought despair, But despair requires the energy to care about your circumstances, and I had long since learned to conserve that energy for survival. Instead, I simply accepted it as I had accepted everything else: the taste of rust, the copper of blood, the grinding machinery that consumed children and processed them as waste. Acceptance was easier than resistance. Acceptance cost fewer calories. But then they sent me to the upper hive, and acceptance became impossible. The assignment came as punishment for some minor infraction I no longer remember, possibly talking back to a training officer or failing to show sufficient enthusiasm during prayer recitations. A week of labor service in the upper levels, maintaining the infrastructure that kept the nobility comfortable in their crystal spires. It meant traveling upward through levels I had never seen before, past the industrial zones and habitation blocks, past the mid-hive residential sectors where citizens lived in conditions that would have seemed paradisiacal to anyone from sub-level 47, and finally into the regions where the architecture stopped being functional and became decorative. The journey took an entire day, passing through dozens of checkpoints where guards examined our papers with increasing suspicion, as if they could not quite believe that creatures from the underhive were being permitted into spaces reserved for those born fortunate. With each level we ascended, the air became cleaner until it hurt to breathe. My lungs, accustomed to toxins, struggling with oxygen that had been filtered and purified and scented with substances I could not identify. The walls were no longer bare metal and corroded stone, but covered in materials chosen for aesthetic rather than structural purposes. Tapestries depicting imperial victories hung in corridors wider than entire streets on sub-level 47. Statues of saints and heroes lined passages where the floor was polished marble rather than grated steel. And then we reached the gardens. Water fell from artificial fountains in cascades that served no purpose beyond beauty. Gallons of clean water wasted every minute to create pleasant sounds and visual effects. Plants grew in carefully tended beds, decorative vegetation that produced nothing edible but existed purely to be looked at, consuming resources that could have sustained hundreds in the lower levels. The air smelled of growing things, of flowers whose names I did not know, of life that was not fungal or toxic or struggling against impossible odds. Through reinforced windows, I glimpsed the lives of those born a few kilometers higher. Children walked past in groups, accompanied by tutors, discussing literature and philosophy and concepts I had no framework for understanding. Their skin was unmarked by chemical burns or industrial scars. Their clothes were tailored specifically for them, not salvaged from reclamation heaps. They laughed with the unself-conscious joy of people who had never known hunger, who had never tasted rust or copper, who had names that meant something beyond a designation number stamped on administratum paperwork. The rage that built inside me was worse than any physical pain I had experienced in 15 years of underhive existence. Not rage at the nobility themselves. They were simply beneficiaries of cosmic lottery, born in the right place rather than the wrong one. The rage was directed at the structure itself, at the fundamental injustice of a universe where everything I had suffered, every death I had witnessed, every person I had killed or failed to save, every compromise that had stripped away pieces of my humanity, all of it had been simply the price of being born in darkness rather than light. The Imperium was not indifferent to suffering. That would have been almost forgivable. The cold calculation of an entity too vast to notice individual pain. Instead, I understood with perfect clarity that the Imperium was built upon suffering, required suffering, treated suffering, as a resource to be managed and harvested with the same efficiency that the reclamation facility sorted waste. The children in the upper spires existed because children in sub-level 47 drank poison and called it sweet. The gardens were watered with resources denied to the lower levels. The clean air was purchased with the compressed toxicity that made the underhive barely habitable. My survival had not been accidental. It had been cultivation, the deliberate creation of soldiers willing to die because they had already learned that life was just another form of dying. The rage lasted exactly 7 days, burning through me during every moment of the work detail, fueled by every glimpse of the upper spire's impossible luxury. When we were returned to the lower levels and the processing facilities where we awaited deployment, the rage guttered out like a candle in an airless room. There was nothing to sustain it. Anger required the belief that things could be different, and I had learned too well that belief was another luxury I could not afford. On the night before deployment off-world, they granted us final leave to settle whatever personal affairs we might have in the lower levels. Most of the recruits had nothing to settle, no one to say farewell to, nowhere to return to even temporarily. But I requested permission to visit sub-level 47 one last time, and they granted it with the indifference of officers who understood that sentiment was harmless when it could not change outcomes. The descent felt longer than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed to existing in higher levels, where the air did not immediately coat your lungs with chemical residue. Each level down stripped away the thin veneer of civilization I had accumulated during my weeks in processing, returning me to the reality I had been born into. By the time I reached sub-level 47, I was breathing shallowly again, my body remembering how to filter toxins, my eyes adjusting to darkness that no longer seemed complete because I had experienced true illumination. The HAB unit where I had spent my childhood was occupied by strangers now. A woman who might have been 30 or 50, her age impossible to determine beneath the accumulated damage of underhive existence. 3 children who stared at me with the same haunted eyes I remembered seeing in reflective surfaces when I was young. A man with chemical stains on his hands that matched the stains my mother had carried to her grave. They looked exactly like the family I had once had, interchangeable components in the Hive's endless machinery of survival and suffering. I did not speak to them. There was nothing to say. They were living the same life I had lived, would make the same compromises I had made, would survive or fail to survive according to the same brutal selection pressures that had shaped me. In 10 years, perhaps one of those children would volunteer for the imperial tithe, seeking escape from a gang or a reclamation facility, or whatever other mechanism had ground them down enough to make military service seem preferable. The cycle continued. It had always continued. It would always continue. I walked through the familiar corridors in darkness, navigating by memory and touch, past the places where bioluminescent fungi had once grown on corpses that served as my childhood lanterns. The bodies were different now, but the fungi glowed with the same gentle light, performing the same function for a new generation of children who needed to see. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. The Hive had existed for thousands of years and would exist for thousands more, consuming generation after generation of children who tasted rust and drank poison and learned that survival was its own form of death. I found the pipe where my first memory had formed, the place where I had licked condensation at age 6 and thought the toxic runoff was sweet. It was still there, still dripping, still warm from whatever it carried through the endless network of conduits. I reached up and caught a droplet on my tongue. The taste was exactly as I remembered. Metal and chemicals and that peculiar sweetness that came from having no reference for what water should actually taste like. And I understood finally what I had been avoiding understanding for years. The child who had licked condensation in the dark was already dead. Had been dead since the moment I pulled my hand back and let Sarah fall into the grinding mechanisms. Had been dead since I drove sharpened rebar through another child's throat. had been dead since I learned that empathy cost calories I could not spare. The death had not been sudden or violent, but gradual, a slow grinding necessity of becoming someone capable of surviving this place. What remained was simply a weapon the Imperium had forged in the darkness, ready to be deployed and expended. I was exactly what they had cultivated me to be. The transport ship departed at the 16th hour, loading us with the same industrial efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of Imperial processing. We were herded into cargo holds designed for equipment transport, racks of metal bunks welded to the walls in configurations that prioritized space optimization over human comfort. Thousands of recruits packed into chambers where the air recyclers struggled to keep pace with our collective respiration. The ship trembled as its engines powered up, a vibration that reminded me of the grinding machinery in the reclamation facility, and I understood that we were simply cargo now, resources being transported to wherever the Imperium had calculated we would provide maximum value before being expended. As the ship lifted from the Hive's landing platforms, I pressed against one of the small viewing ports, seeing for the first time the full scope of the structure that had defined my entire existence. The Hive was a mountain of metal and stone that pierced the clouds, rising kilometers into a sky that roiled with chemical storms and toxic precipitation. But it was not alone. Dozens of similar mountains surrounded it, each one a mirror of the first, all belching toxic smoke from countless manufactorums and processing facilities, all glowing with the fires of industry that never ceased, all housing billions of souls living in conditions that ranged from merely terrible to absolutely hellish. The planet fell away beneath us as we climbed toward orbit, and I watched through the viewport as its full horror became visible. What I had thought was, the world was merely one industrial zone among hundreds. The entire surface was covered in hives, massive structures separated by stretches of wasteland so thoroughly poisoned that nothing could live there. The oceans had turned the color of rust from millennia of industrial runoff. The atmosphere was thick with pollution, obscuring what might once have been continents and mountain ranges beneath a shroud of toxic cloud. This was a world that had been completely consumed by humanity's need to survive, transformed from whatever it had been into a machine for producing more humans to feed into the Imperium's endless wars. And I understood with perfect clarity that this was not an aberration. The officers had spoken casually of other Hive worlds during our processing, had referenced recruitment quotas from dozens of planets with similar designations. This was the norm. Most of humanity lived this way, compressed into vertical cities where the lower levels existed in perpetual darkness, and the lucky ones died young. The Imperium consisted primarily of places like this, worlds where billions of children tasted rust in the dark and learned to call it sweetness because they had no other reference for what water should be. The galaxy was full of sub-level 47s, full of children licking condensation from pipes and thinking themselves blessed, full of reclamation facilities that ground human beings into waste and processed them as efficiently as any other industrial byproduct, full of gangs ruling fungal forests and speaking of the Emperor's protection while trafficking in narcotics and flesh, full of work placement tests designed to confirm that the damned belonged in damnation, full of gardens in upper spires watered with resources denied to those below. The ship's Geller field activated as we prepared to enter the warp, and in that brief moment of unreality between dimensions, I glimpsed something else. Other possibilities, other lives, other versions of the child who had once licked condensation from a pipe at age 6. In one, that child learned to read and became a scholar. In another, he died at age 7 from toxic exposure. In another, he was born on a different level and never tasted rust at all. In another, He refused to pull his hand back when Sarah reached for him, and they both fell into the grinding mechanisms together. All of them dead. All of them sacrificed to the simple mathematics of Imperial survival. Every possibility collapsed into the single reality of what I had become. A weapon forged in darkness, ready to be deployed and expended on some distant battlefield in service to an Imperium that required suffering the way engines required fuel. The warp swallowed us, and the viewport showed nothing but impossible colors that hurt to perceive. I turned away and found my assigned bunk, lay down in darkness that was no longer complete, and waited for whatever came next. What came next was 15 years of war. I am a sergeant now in the Astra Militarum, decorated for valor on worlds whose names I have learned to pronounce, marked by scars that make the old chemical burns from the reclamation facility seem quaint by comparison. I have seen a dozen planets, fought enemies that the child-licking condensation on sub-level 47 could never have imagined. Orc hordes that charged our lines with the mindless enthusiasm of a species born for war. Chaos cultists whose bodies had been twisted by powers that made the mutations in the Underhive fungal forests look merciful. Tyrannid bioforms that consumed everything organic and left behind only silence. I have earned commendations and survived battles that killed better soldiers than I will ever be. But the taste of rust never leaves. In the recycled water of troop transports, I taste it. In the blood from split lips during close combat, I taste it. In the rain on alien worlds with atmospheres nothing like the toxic sky above my birth hive, I taste it. Always there is that metallic sweetness that triggers memory, that returns me to age 6, crouched in darkness, licking condensation from a pipe and thinking myself blessed. The taste has become a kind of anchor, a reminder of what I was before the Imperium made me useful. I have learned that every regiment is full of soldiers like me, men and women forged in similar darkness on different worlds, shaped by different forms of suffering, but fundamentally identical in what they represent. We are the products of Hive worlds and Death worlds and Feral worlds, and 1,000 other classifications of misery. We are what the Imperium creates when it takes children and grinds away everything except the capacity to follow orders and kill efficiently. The entire vast machinery of human survival runs on the fuel of stolen childhoods and commodified suffering, and we are the refined product of that process. This is what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. To be born in darkness and claw toward light that may not exist. To become a weapon because weapons at least have purpose. To survive not because survival is meaningful, but because the alternative is oblivion, and even meaningless existence is preferable to nothing. Last month, we captured a Hive city on a world I will not name, liberating it from heretic forces that had turned its upper spires into temples of obscene worship. During the post-battle sweep through the lower levels, I found a child in the ruins of a collapsed habitation sector. She was perhaps 6 years old, crouched in darkness so complete my helmet lumen was the first real light she had probably ever seen. She was licking condensation from a broken pipe, her tongue catching droplets that fell from corroded metal, her eyes closed in something approaching contentment. I watched her for a long moment, this small creature who looked exactly as I must have looked 15 years ago, who was tasting rust and chemical runoff and thinking it sweet because she had no reference for what water should be. I could have told her the truth, could have explained what lay ahead if she survived. The reclamation facilities or the gangs or the military service that would turn her into something capable of killing without feeling. Could have warned her about the taste that would follow her forever, triggering memories of a childhood spent in darkness, learning to drink poison. Instead, I said nothing. There was no comfort to offer because comfort would be a lie, and she deserved better than lies even if she could have nothing else. I simply bore witness to her existence, acknowledged that she was alive in this moment, tasting rust and surviving. The child lives. The cycle continues. It has always continued. It will always continue, on this world and 1,000 others, in the depths of hives that have stood for millennia and will stand for millennia more. And in that terrible continuity, there is something almost holy. The knowledge that survival itself is an act of defiance against a universe that wants nothing more than to grind humanity into dust. She opened her eyes and looked at me without fear. This child, who had probably never seen an Imperial Guard uniform, who had no context for understanding what I represented. Then she returned to her pipe, catching another droplet, tasting rust, and calling it sweet. For now, that is enough.